Hi, thank you very much. It's very glad to hear that. And welcome, Andrea. We are talking about today a little bit carbon market and voluntary carbon market issue today. Before the starting, I would like to say something about, the carbon market is very important tool to reach the global climate goals, particularly in the short and medium term. And also the Paris Agreement set also a global framework to avoid dangerous climate change by limiting global warming to well below the 2 degrees and foreseeing efforts to limit to 1.5 degrees. And it's also aims to strengthen countries able to deal with the impacts of climate change and support them in their efforts. But we are here today for the green business. And we would like to start with Andrea, especially the business side. So, Andrea, welcome to our conference, first of all. And I would like to ask you as a first question, what does carbon emissions mean in business?
Well, that's a great place to start. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a delight to join you today. As you mentioned, I am with the International Emission Trading Association. And that's an important context to your question because it is a business association of over 300 members, all working to advance carbon markets. So we very much deal every day with businesses who are trying to get their heads around this challenge of participating in helping deliver the Paris goals. Mm-hmm. It's incredibly challenging for businesses to navigate this transition, this massive energy transition. It's different by sector of industry, of course. So the starting point, I think, for all businesses is to consider the sector that they're in. Because the options to decarbonize change from sector to sector. Mm-hmm. So that really is the starting point. Where do I fit in? What's the sector of business that I'm in? And what are the options that I have to decarbonize? What is the toolkit, if you like, that I have available for me to use? And how quickly is that toolkit available? Mm-hmm.
How do carbon emissions affect business and economy? I mean, why become a carbon neutral business so important in the recent time?
Yes, well, clearly, the reason we have the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement is because we are trying to reduce the impact of anthropogenic emissions. So those are the man-made emissions that are increasing at an exponential rate since the sort of industrial revolution time. And the planet is warming at an unprecedented scale, and all the world's scientists who are represented by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, are in agreement that the heating of the planet is due to greenhouse gases and the increase in rate of greenhouse gases. So we all need to do all we can. This is a problem that affects each and every one of us. I guess you could think of it as the most democratic problem the world has ever had. It affects wealthy and poor nations. It affects all walks of society. And the ones who are really going to bear the brunt of it are the future generations. So we have an obligation on each and every one of us to do our part. Quite often we get lost in the sort of detail, lost in the high level comments. So we're trying to reduce emissions according to the Paris goals. The Paris goals say we should, strive for 1.5 degrees, but no more than 2 degrees. But in actual fact, the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is huge in terms of the impact that it's going to have on our lives. The warming of temperatures, the increased deserts that will form, the increased torrential rainfall. So that's why, to answer your question directly, that's why we all need to play a role. And maybe just to add that I think businesses are doing an amazing job of getting on board. Ever since the Paris Agreement, we saw a huge surge of business interest in committing to net zero and recognizing their role in helping to participate in delivery of the Paris goals.
Exactly. And also stakeholders will also demand it. Am I right? I mean, the shareholders and all customers also.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting about this. I think in the beginning, certainly when I worked at BP, when we first started looking at how do we reduce our carbon impact, it looked so incredibly hard to do. But if you take a step back and you think about this as a system-wide change, that this change is happening across the world, sure, at different paces, but across the world, then you realize that as a business, you don't want to get left behind. So although some of those changes may seem difficult now, it's a much wiser and a low-risk business decision to start decarbonizing as soon as possible, because absolutely, as you say, your shareholders are going to demand it. Your customers are going to demand it. Your suppliers are going to be increasingly wanting to supply you low carbon products. So the whole ecosystem, of course, including your competitors, are going to be changing. And the longer you leave it, the more expensive the choices become. So say, for example, you want to buy lower carbon, you want to develop a wind farm, for example, the choices of land available for wind farms are going to become more and more restricted. If you're needing to sell off high carbon assets, it's going to become more difficult to sell them as you move on. So very important that businesses get on the journey to decarbonize as soon as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And they also reduce their risk to stand still. Am I right?
That's absolutely right. I think, on the one hand, you can look at the climate and net zero delivery as the right thing to do. We need to do it for ourselves. We need to do it for our children. But on the other hand, it's a very wise business decision.
Yeah.
And you really do need to, as a business, look at it through the lens of risk. The risk of standing still, the risk of not acting, and the risk of missing out on opportunities. Maybe just one other point to add in terms of business is that there's a lot of knowledge that needs to be acquired and built around decarbonizing. Understanding how to measure your carbon footprint.
Yeah.
That's a skill. So many companies initially will buy in those skills, say, through a consultancy, but increasingly they realize that this is a skill that you need in the business because it's like financial accounting. You need to count your carbon emissions. It's that fundamental now to business operations because you need to demonstrate that you reduced in emissions. So you need those internal skills of what are my carbon emissions? How do I reduce them? How do each of the activities in my business contribute either towards increasing or decreasing emissions? Mm-hmm. And that information has to be made available to the boardroom. So it needs to be accurate. It needs to be based on good systems. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of knowledge that needs to be acquired. And that's another reason for companies to really get going.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, Andrea. And for instance, if the company calculated their footprint and the company set it as a goal, how they can use them on their business strategy? What are you thinking?
Yes, that's right. So I think the important thing if companies are new and they're thinking about, the steps that they take, absolutely step number one is calculate your carbon footprint. Mm-hmm. Step number two would be understand how much you need to decarbonize to be on what we call a science-based pathway. So you can't decarbonize at any rate you like. That's not acceptable. You need to decarbonize at a rate aligned with the science of delivering the Paris Agreement. And there are organizations who can assist with that. Once you work out those two paths, so what your carbon footprint is today and to what extent you need to decarbonize, you then have that gap that you need to do to try and get those emissions down. And that's where the strategy work comes in. So you need to look at the tools in your toolkit. What alternative can you switch to? Electric vehicles? Can you switch to renewable energy? So what are all the levers that you can pull to bring that carbon footprint down? And then, of course, that's where carbon offsetting comes in, because you will find that, chances are once you've applied all of those tools, you still have a gap. And that's where I think the role of carbon credits can come in. But maybe just two other steps. So set your carbon footprint, look at how to decarbonize. The next thing you really need to do is set targets. Because without targets, you don't bring your shareholders and your stakeholders along. They want to know that they can hold your feet to the fire, that you are committed to decarbonizing at a certain pace, and that they can hold you to those targets that you've set for yourself.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, if the companies declare this publicity, etc., and then I am sure that also the customers has more trust the companies and they feel better.
Yes, exactly. Sorry. Yes, yeah. Agreeing.
And finally, as we know, IETA has published a paper which is called Evolving Voluntary Carbon Market at the first day of European Climate Summit in Lisbon, Portugal. What would you like to say about this paper, and what is the most important conclusion of this paper? I think this is a very good paper, by the way. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you found it useful. It was an awful lot of work. These things take lots of work. So the paper is called The Evolving Voluntary Carbon Market. And for those listeners joining today who are new to the voluntary carbon market, I think you'll find it a very useful read. What it sets out to do is really take a photograph of the current status in the voluntary carbon market. And the reason that's important is because this is a very evolving market. That's why the paper is called The Evolving Voluntary Carbon Market. It's undergoing so much change. And it's very difficult for people who are new to this market to understand all the moving pieces. You need to understand the supply side and the issues on integrity. You need to understand the demand side. You need to understand the intermediaries, the service providers, the rating agencies. You need to understand how digital and blockchain is impacting this market. And you need to understand where the voluntary carbon market sits alongside of the Paris Agreement's Article 6, which is about trading between countries. Mm-hmm. So you need to really sort of understand these pieces as a whole. And so that if you want to engage in the voluntary carbon market, which is a very valuable tool that companies have at their disposal, you have a resource to sort of try and help you get to grips with all the moving pieces and the language and the awful acronyms, which of course are always there. But that's the role of the paper.
Yeah. And would you like to also summarize some conclusions, remarks related with this report?
Yes, sure. So the paper is divided into 4 parts. Mm-hmm. The first part is called Net Zero Guidance and the inclusion of offsetting. So that's net zero guidance for corporates. So corporates who are trying to deliver net zero to do their part in the Paris Agreement, and then how to include offsetting. So that's section number 1. Mm-hmm. Section number 2 is the voluntary carbon market and the Paris Agreement, mm-hmm. and how, although the Paris Agreement doesn't set the rules for the voluntary carbon market, because the voluntary carbon market is an unregulated market, it does have a bearing on the voluntary carbon market. And we do see these markets converging over time. And already, indeed, there's a bit of convergence, which I can talk more about if you like. Mm-hmm. Number 3 is about the proliferation of crediting approaches. Mm-hmm. So that's the fact that you have the voluntary carbon market, you have Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, you have Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, and then you have some compliance schemes which allow the use of credits from voluntary standards to be incorporated within that. So there's all these different approaches, adds to complexity. We try and sort of simplify that. And then the final piece is on the governance. So there's been a lot in the media about questions around quality. And it's very important that a voluntary unregulated market like this is actually self-regulating and that it has checks and balances. So this looks at some of the questions that regulators have asked of the voluntary carbon market and says, do we actually want this market to be a little bit more regulated? Would that be helpful or not? Mm-hmm. So it looks at those questions. And then
questions.
Yes, exactly. And I think the challenge is, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, as the saying goes, because the benefits of the voluntary carbon market are it's international. So you can be a buyer in one country, buying credits applied in another country. So every country can participate as buyers or sellers in the voluntary carbon market. So it's international. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have the strict regulations that make it very difficult to trade commodities across borders. It doesn't have that. So it's flexible, it's agile, it's economic because it follows a markets-based approach. So it's very, at the moment, very economical. Of course, the price of credits will rise over time as carbon budgets get smaller. But at the moment, it's a very cost-effective and cost-competitive mitigation activity. So it's got a lot of advantages. And what you don't want is that regulation dampens that. Yeah. But what we really want for this market is that we have integrity, that the market is trusted mm-hmm. by investors and by buyers, mm-hmm. that the market grows in scale. That's absolutely critical. And as it grows in scale, it's more liquid, there's more credits available. Price discovery is easier to do for buyers. So those are the sort of topics that we explore in the paper, what it is today and really how we would like to see it evolving.
Yeah. And yes, as you said, that's why the voluntary carbon market is very huge now, and compliance market has fallen down after the Kyoto Protocol, we know, and that's why the Paris Agreement and 6.2, 6.4 is very detailed for some business people maybe, but we know very much in this market, and we are dealing with this issue very much. But hopefully everything will be better in the voluntary market, and as you said, it will be very important for the buyers and it's internationally and easy way to fight with the climate change. So maybe also I would like to ask you where to find the further reading for the people. I mean, how can they find this report and read this report?
Yes, sure. So the report is available on the IETA website. That's IETA, which stands for the International Emission Trading Association. Uh-huh. I think it's still there's a advert on the front page, but if it's not there anymore, you can go to resources and you will find it under resources. By all means, I can send you a link afterwards, which you could share with the audience. But the paper is available there. as I say, it is the other piece I mean to add, sorry, is that there's a second part to the paper which would be published shortly. So the first part is the piece that I've described with those four sections. Mm-hmm. The second part is more of a database that we have put together of all the different types of guidance that exist in carbon markets. So the guidance, say, from the Science Based Targets Initiative, the guidance from the Oxford Guiding Principles, the Nordic Dialogue. So there's a lot of guidance on how to do carbon offsetting well. That's available in this guidance document. And maybe now would also be a good point to just mention that the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, that's the VCMI, have today released their guidance documents. So they've today, literally, I've just seen it, released their toolkit on voluntary carbon markets. And that's a super piece of work. And what it's particularly good at doing is showing how the markets link to the Paris Agreement. So country as Turkey has a nationally determined contribution, and each country does, the delivery of that NDC is absolutely critical for countries, and countries need to develop a strategy for how carbon markets help deliver their NDC, and the voluntary carbon market can fit within that broad strategy. So it sort of helps show how it all fits together.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, this is a very useful report and very understandable for everyone, I think. Thanks again for everyone working in it. And also, would you like anything say about the voluntary carbon market or NDC or whatever? Please add, and then we can close this session.
Sure. I guess there's two other points I would like to make, and it's really going back to the point on integrity, because I'm not sure to the extent that some of the negative press has been covered in the media in Turkey, but it's certainly here in London, there's been quite a lot of coverage, and that's brought a lot of nervousness to the market. So I would like to address that point. There are a number of very, very important initiatives underway to address quality and integrity. Because if this market's going to scale, we really, as I say, we need people to trust it and to believe that one carbon credit equals 1 ton of emissions reduced or removed. Yeah. So one of those key ones, I'll mention 3. The first one I've mentioned, which is the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, and that deals more on the demand side. What are the claims that a company can make if they're using carbon credits as part of their strategy? How many carbon credits can they use? So that's the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. The other one deals on the supply side, and that's the Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon market, ICVCM. The Integrity Council has released their first set of documents. The second set of documents will come out mid-year. And what the ICVCM is doing is saying, if we put a badge on a carbon credit, you can trust that that carbon credit is high quality. Because part of the challenge people have had is it's difficult to understand what good quality is, because you get so many different types of carbon projects, from cook stoves to renewables to energy switching to waste. So how do you know what quality is as a layman? And not everybody wants to put expertise in place to make that decision. So this will help. The third one I want to mention is actually an accreditation program, which is run by IETA. And it's called ICROA. ICROA stands for the International Carbon Reduction and Offsetting Accreditation, ICROA. This program is for anyone who is selling credits and advising corporates on the use of credit. So if there are corporates in the audience and you want to get involved in the carbon market, I really urge you to look for a supplier that is ICROA accredited, because those suppliers have to follow a code of best practice and they get audited every year against that code. And that ensures, or helps to ensure, nothing is absolutely foolproof, but it helps to ensure that the advice that you get in on how to develop a carbon strategy and what carbon credits to use is of a high integrity and a high quality and from a highly reputable supplier.
Yeah. That's a very good point. Thank you for everything, Andrea, and thank you for joining us today. And I hope the audience is also useful, and talk to you soon. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation, and enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you.